The boardroom at Forrester Creations had witnessed countless battles over the years, but that morning carried a different kind of electricity, sharp and volatile, as if the air itself were bracing for impact. Power struggles were nothing new within those walls, yet the tension unfolding around the long, polished table felt heavier, layered with years of unresolved grievances, loyalties hardened into reflex, and fear disguised as righteous certainty. Steffi sat at the head of the room, spine straight, jaw tight, every inch the executive leader she had fought relentlessly to become. Her presence alone was a declaration. She would not yield, not today, not on Thomas, not on the future of the company she believed she was sworn to protect at all costs. Across from her, Hope's composure barely concealed the emotional weight she carried. Her arguments were measured, her words carefully chosen, but the hurt beneath them pulsed visibly, shaped by history rather than abstract policy. To Hope, this was never just about corporate governance or creative direction. It was about accountability, about patterns that had been excused for too long under the guise of family loyalty and genius. Deke, seated beside her, reinforced those concerns with a colder edge, his tone sharpened by skepticism and an unyielding insistence on consequences. He spoke not from sentiment but from principle, framing Thomas as a liability rather than an asset, a risk that threatened not only the brand's reputation, but its moral foundation. Steffi countered every point with precision, her voice firm, unwavering. She spoke of redemption, of talent, of growth hard-won and easily dismissed by those who had never walked the same road. She framed Thomas not as a man defined by his worst decisions, but as one shaped by struggle, someone who had paid dearly for his mistakes and emerged determined to do better. To Steffi, protecting Thomas was not blind favoritism. It was an act of belief in second chances, a value she held as fiercely as any corporate vision statement. Her words cut through the room, forcing even her opponents to acknowledge the depth of her conviction. Yet beneath that conviction, something was shifting. At first it was subtle, a tightening behind her eyes, a flicker of disorientation she dismissed as fatigue. Steffi had learned long ago to push through discomfort, to treat physical limits as inconveniences rather than warnings. The meeting dragged on, voices overlapping, tempers flaring, and with every passing minute, the room seemed to tilt just slightly off balance. The lights felt harsher, the air thinner. Steffi reached for her glass of water, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly, a betrayal she masked by curling her fingers into a fist beneath the table. As Hope spoke again, outlining her concerns with a quiet intensity that resonated more deeply than she intended, Steffi felt a sudden wave of dizziness crash over her without mercy. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the arguments, the accusations, the familiar rhythm of corporate warfare. She tried to speak, to interject, but the words tangled somewhere between thought and breath. The room blurred, faces smearing into indistinct shapes, and for the first time in a long while, Steffi felt something dangerously close to fear, not fear of losing control of the company, but fear of losing control of herself. The moment she collapsed was not dramatic in the way scandals often were at Forrester. There was no shouted accusation, no slamming of doors. It happened quietly, almost anticlimactically, as Steffi's body simply gave up the fight her will had been waging. 1 second she was standing, intent on reclaiming the floor, and the next she was falling, consciousness slipping away before anyone could catch her. The room erupted into chaos only after she hit the ground, chairs scraping back, voices rising in alarm as the reality of what had just happened finally registered. In that instant, the argument ceased to matter. Thomas, Hope, Deke, Ridge, every grievance dissolved in the face of something far more urgent. Ridge was on his feet immediately, panic cutting through his authoritative presence as he knelt beside his daughter, calling her name with a desperation that stripped away decades of corporate armor. For a man who had built his life around control, of business, of family, of narrative, there was nothing more terrifying than watching Steffi lie motionless on the cold boardroom floor. The ambulance ride passed in fragments, memories and sensations blurring together as Steffy drifted in and out of awareness. Hospital lights replaced boardroom chandeliers, sterile and unforgiving, illuminating the fragility she so rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Finn was there almost instantly, his professional calm barely concealing the fear clawing at his chest. As both husband and doctor, he occupied an impossible space, torn between emotional instinct and clinical necessity, forced to compartmentalize his dread in order to do his job. Hours later, when Steffy finally regained consciousness, the world felt quieter, heavier, as if reality itself had shifted while she was gone. Finn's expression told her everything before he even spoke, his eyes holding a mixture of relief, awe, and caution. The words came carefully, deliberately, as though saying them too quickly might shatter their meaning. Steffy was pregnant. The revelation landed with a weight that no one had anticipated. It reframed everything, her collapse, her exhaustion, the relentless pressure she had been carrying without pause. For Steffy, the news stirred a storm of emotions she could not immediately untangle. Joy flickered, instinctive and undeniable, followed swiftly by fear, responsibility, and the sobering awareness that her life was about to change in ways no board vote could control. She had faced countless challenges with confidence, but this one reached beyond strategy and authority into something far more vulnerable. Rich received the news as both a blessing and a reckoning. Relief that his daughter was safe collided with an overwhelming sense of guilt as he replayed every moment he had pushed her, every expectation he had placed on her shoulders without fully acknowledging the cost. Seeing Steffy in a hospital bed, reduced from the force of nature she was at Forrester to a patient in need of care, forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that ambition, even when justified, could exact a brutal toll. When word reached the rest of the family and the Forrester executive circle, shock rippled outward, halting ongoing disputes with abrupt finality. The boardroom conflict that had seemed so critical hours earlier now felt strangely hollow. Hope grappled with a complicated mix of concern and self-reflection, questioning whether the intensity of that confrontation had contributed to Steffy's condition. Deke, ever pragmatic, recognized immediately that this development would alter the company's trajectory, raising questions no one had been prepared to answer so suddenly. At Forrester Creations, operations continued out of necessity, but the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. Conversations were quieter, decisions more tentative, as executives weighed the implications of Steffy's pregnancy with caution. Her leadership had been a stabilizing force, a constant amid shifting alliances and creative upheaval. The possibility that she might need to step back, even temporarily, unsettled those who relied on her decisiveness and emboldened those who saw an opening for influence. Steffy herself lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her hospital room, confronting the collision of identities she had spent her life carefully balancing. She was a CEO, a daughter, a wife, a mother, and now, once again, she was carrying new life. The question was not whether she could do it all. She had always believed she could. The question was whether she should, and at what cost. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that strength might not always mean endurance, that leadership could also mean knowing when to relinquish control. Finn remained a steady presence, grounding her in moments when anxiety threatened to spiral. He reminded her that vulnerability did not diminish her authority, that stepping back to protect her health and her child was not a failure, but an act of responsibility. His words resonated, though they did not erase the fear that loomed over her professional future. Steffy knew the industry well enough to understand how quickly perception could shift, how pregnancy, for all its celebration, could be weaponized against women in positions of power. Rich found himself navigating unfamiliar territory as well, torn between his role as a father desperate to protect his child and as a leader facing the practical realities of succession and stability. The thought of Forrester without Steffy at the helm unsettled him deeply, yet the thought of pushing her to continue as if nothing had changed felt unthinkable. In quiet moments, he questioned the legacy he had built, wondering whether his relentless drive had inadvertently taught his children that rest was weakness and sacrifice an obligation rather than a choice. The board would eventually reconvene, the arguments postponed but not erased. Thomas's future at the company remained unresolved, Hope's concerns still valid, Deke's warnings still echoing in the background. Yet everything now existed within a new context, one that demanded a reckoning not just with corporate ethics but with humanity itself. Steffy's collapse had stripped the conflict of its abstraction, reminding everyone in that room that behind every title and agenda was a body capable of breaking under pressure. As Steffy prepared to leave the hospital, the weight of expectation followed her, but so did something unfamiliar: permission to pause. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with decisions that would test her in ways no boardroom battle ever had. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was also resolve, a quieter, deeper resolve rooted not in dominance or defense, but in balance. The pregnancy did not end the power struggles at Forrester Creations. It transformed them. It forced conversations that had long been avoided and raised questions that could no longer be deferred. Who truly held power, and at what cost? What did leadership look like when vulnerability was no longer optional? And how much was a company willing to change to protect the people who sustained it? For Steffy, the answers would not come easily, but she understood one thing with clarity she had never known before. The life growing inside her was not a weakness to be managed or concealed. It was a truth that demanded space, respect, and courage, not just from her, but from everyone who claimed to stand beside her. And in that truth lay the potential not only for upheaval, but for transformation, both personal and profound. The knowledge of Steffy's pregnancy did not arrive gently into Finn's consciousness. It crashed into him with the force of something both miraculous and terrifying, reshaping the way he looked at every breath she took, every decision she made, every risk she had long considered routine. From the moment the confirmation left his lips in the hospital room, Finn's world narrowed instinctively around one truth: Steffy was no longer carrying only herself. The woman he loved, the child growing inside her, suddenly became fragile in a way that cut through his training as a doctor and struck at the rawest part of him as a husband and a father. Logic told him pregnancy was not an illness, that women like Steffy carried strength in every cell of their bodies, but emotion drowned out logic almost immediately. He had seen too much, knew too much about what stress could do, about how relentless pressure could erode even the strongest body. And Steffy lived under pressure the way others lived under sunlight, constantly, without pause, without mercy. Finn's protectiveness was not loud at first. It manifested in watchful silences, in the way his eyes followed her movements, in the subtle adjustments he tried to make without drawing attention. He encouraged rest with gentle insistence, suggested breaks disguised as concern rather than command, and tried to shield her from anything that might elevate her stress. Yet Forrester Creations was not something that could be muted or postponed with kind words. The conflict between Thomas and Hope pulsed through Steffy's life like a second heartbeat, demanding her attention, her judgment, her authority. Finn watched her answer calls from the hospital bed, saw the familiar fire ignite in her eyes when the company was mentioned, and felt fear tighten in his chest. To him, those battles were no longer abstract corporate disputes. They were tangible threats to her health, to their child, to the future he had only just begun to imagine more fully. When Finn finally spoke firmly, it was not out of control but out of desperation. He asked her to step back, not forever, not as surrender, but as protection. He insisted that Forrester could survive a pause, that Ridge could shoulder the burden temporarily, that Thomas and Hope's conflict did not need her immediate arbitration. In his mind, the equation was simple: no company, no legacy, no power struggle was worth the risk of losing her or their baby. But Steffy did not live in equations that simple, and Finn underestimated how deeply his request would cut. For Steffy, his insistence felt like a sudden narrowing of a world she had fought her entire life to expand. She understood his fear. She shared it more than she was willing to admit. Yet the idea of stepping away, even temporarily, struck at her identity in ways that unsettled her profoundly. Forrester Creations was not just her workplace. It was an inheritance forged through conflict, expectation, and sacrifice. She had earned her place not because she was Ridge's daughter, but because she had proven herself again and again under conditions that would have broken others. To step back now, at the moment when the company was most volatile, felt to her like abandonment masquerading as self-care. The pressure Finn placed on her was not malicious, but it was relentless in its own way. Every conversation circled back to rest, to boundaries, to the dangers of stress. Steffi found herself torn between gratitude for his love and resentment at what felt like an erosion of her autonomy. She had spent years fighting to be seen as capable in spaces that questioned her authority at every turn. Pregnancy, she feared, would become another reason for others to doubt her resilience, to sideline her under the guise of concern. Finn's protectiveness, however well-intentioned, amplified that fear. At night, when the house was quiet and the adrenaline of the day finally ebbed, Steffi lay awake wrestling with questions she had never allowed herself to fully confront. Could she truly do it all, as she had always claimed? Was strength defined by endurance alone, or did it also require discernment, the courage to choose differently when circumstances changed? The child growing inside her was not an abstract future anymore. It was a present reality, one that demanded consideration in every decision she made. Yet so did Forrester, so did the employees who relied on her leadership, so did the legacy she was expected to uphold. Finn, watching her struggle, felt his own conflict deepen. He did not want to become another voice telling Steffi who she should be or how she should live. He loved her precisely because of her fire, her refusal to shrink. But the stakes had changed, and he could not unsee the vulnerability beneath her strength. Each time she dismissed his concerns, he felt the sharp edge of helplessness, the same helplessness he experienced with patience when outcomes rested beyond his control. This time, however, the patient was the woman he loved, and the consequences were deeply personal. Ridge stood at the center of a parallel storm, his joy at Steffi's pregnancy colliding violently with the chaos unfolding at Forrester Creations. The news of the baby filled him with a happiness that felt almost sacred, a reminder of continuity, of life persisting beyond boardrooms and rivalries. Yet that joy was inseparable from anxiety. Ridge had built Forrester with an understanding that family and business were inextricably linked, but never had that link felt so precarious. Steffi was not just his daughter. She was his anchor, the one he trusted to see clearly when emotions ran high, the one who could confront Thomas without destroying him, who could challenge hope without dismissing her pain. The competition from Katie's new fashion house only intensified Ridge's unease. For the first time in a long while, Forrester faced a rival not born of hostility, but of independence, a brand that carried the weight of personal history and unspoken resentment. Ridge felt stretched thin, pulled between defending his company against external threats and managing the internal fractures that threatened to tear it apart from within. In this environment, Steffi's absence felt unthinkable. Yet the image of her collapsing in the boardroom, of her lying pale and unconscious on the floor, haunted him with relentless clarity. Ridge wanted to protect his daughter, to tell her that nothing mattered more than her health and her child. At the same time, he needed her. Not just as a CEO, but as a stabilizing force, a voice of reason in a company that thrived on passion and impulse. This duality tormented him, forcing him into decisions that felt like betrayals no matter which path he chose. When he encouraged Steffi to rest, a part of him feared he was weakening Forrester at its most vulnerable moment. When he leaned on her expertise, he worried he was complicit in pushing her beyond safe limits. Steffi felt this tension acutely, sensing the unspoken weight in her father's expectations even when he tried to mask them with reassurance. She knew Ridge's confidence in her was genuine, but it carried an implicit plea: "Don't leave me to handle this alone." The thought of stepping back and watching from the sidelines while Ridge navigated Thomas and Hope's conflict, while Katie's company gained ground, filled her with a restless dread. Yet the thought of ignoring Finn's warnings, of risking her pregnancy for the sake of control, left her equally unsettled. It represented not only a professional crisis, but a deeply personal one, rooted in family, history, and unresolved pain. Steffy had always positioned herself as Thomas's protector, the one who believed in his capacity for redemption even when others lost faith. To step away now felt like abandoning him at a moment when he needed her most. At the same time, she understood Hope's fear, the exhaustion of being asked repeatedly to forgive, to compromise, to carry the emotional cost of others' mistakes. Steffy's role had always been to balance these competing truths, and relinquishing that role felt like relinquishing a part of herself. Finn's insistence grew firmer as the days passed, his concern sharpening into resolve. He spoke not only as a husband but as a physician, outlining risks, reminding her that stress was not an abstract concept but a measurable factor with real consequences. His words were calm, rational, and impossible to dismiss outright. Yet each reminder felt to Steffy like another door closing, another option being quietly removed from her grasp. She began to feel as though her life was being restructured around her pregnancy in ways she had not consented to, even as she acknowledged the necessity of some change. Ridge, caught between them, struggled to articulate his own needs without sounding selfish. He saw the toll this conflict took on Steffy, the way her energy fluctuated, the way moments of joy were punctured by waves of worry. He also saw the instability at Forrester intensify, sensed the growing confidence of Katie's rival brand, and felt the familiar fear of losing ground in an industry that rewarded innovation and punished hesitation. In private moments, he questioned whether his dependence on Steffy had become too great, whether he had inadvertently placed her in an impossible position by relying on her strength without considering its limits. As days turned into weeks, the tension between family and career ceased to be theoretical. Decisions loomed that could not be postponed indefinitely. Board meetings were scheduled, deadlines approached, and the question of Steffy's role grew more urgent. Would she formally step back, even temporarily, allowing Ridge to assume full control? Or would she continue to lead, asserting that pregnancy did not negate her capability? Each option carried consequences that rippled outward, affecting not only her immediate family, but the entire Forrester ecosystem. In quiet moments, Steffy found herself reflecting on the example she wanted to set, not only for her children but for herself. She had always prided herself on resilience, on refusing to let circumstances dictate her path. Yet resilience, she was beginning to realize, did not always mean pushing forward at all costs. It could also mean adapting, redefining strength in a way that honored both ambition and vulnerability. This realization did not bring clarity so much as deepened the complexity of her choice. Finn watched her wrestle with these thoughts, his own guilt growing alongside his concern. He feared that in trying to protect her, he was inadvertently diminishing her, reducing her identity to her pregnancy rather than embracing the totality of who she was. He struggled to find language that honored her autonomy while still advocating fiercely for her health. Love, he was learning, was not simply about protection but about trust, about believing that she could navigate this crossroads even if her choices frightened him. Ridge's internal battle reached a breaking point when he recognized that his indecision risked harming Steffy more than any external threat. By needing her while simultaneously urging her to rest, he was pulling her in opposing directions, forcing her to absorb the weight of his conflict along with her own. This realization pushed him toward difficult decisions, ones that required him to confront his own limits and the possibility that Forrester might need to evolve without Steffy's constant presence. When Steffy finally began to articulate her fears aloud, to both Finn and Ridge, the conversation was raw and unsettling. She spoke of the terror of being sidelined, of becoming invisible in a world that respected her only when she proved herself relentlessly. She spoke of her love for Forrester, for Thomas, for the legacy she carried, and of her equally profound love for her family, for the life growing inside her. She did not present solutions, only truths, acknowledging that there was no choice free of loss. That honesty shifted something fundamental between them. Finn saw more clearly the depth of her struggle, understanding that his protectiveness, while rooted in love, needed to leave room for her agency. Ridge, confronted with the consequences of his dependence, began to consider ways to stabilize Forrester without leaning so heavily on Steffy's shoulders. These realizations did not resolve the conflict, but they softened its edges, transforming it from a battle of opposing demands into a shared reckoning. The path forward remained uncertain, fraught with compromises that would test all of them. Steffy stood at the center of that uncertainty, aware that whatever choice she made would redefine her life in ways she could not fully predict. Yet within that uncertainty lay a possibility she had rarely allowed herself to consider, that she did not have to be everything to everyone all the time, that stepping back in one area might create space for growth in another. The pregnancy did not weaken Steffy. It revealed the complexity of her strength. It forced Finn to confront the limits of protection and Ridge to confront the limits of reliance. It exposed fault lines not only within Forrester creations, but within the identities they had all constructed around ambition, legacy, and love. As the future unfolded, one truth became unavoidable. The choices ahead would shape not only the company and the family, but the very definition of power they had long taken for granted.